All right, the question that I'm going to talk about is, I think, the largest question in contemporary philosophy today, and in a way, it's the largest question in intellectual life. And the question is, how do we give an account of ourselves that is consistent with what we know about how the world is anyhow? You see, the central fact about knowledge is it grows, and we know a lot more than we did 100 or 300 years ago. And we have a pretty good idea about the basic structure of the universe. Roughly speaking, it's a matter of physical particles in fields of force. Particles, probably the wrong word. Maybe there's strings or points of mass energy. But anyway, I leave that. I'm paying the physicists to sort that out. Okay. But now, if that's what the universe consists in, is physical particles, those physical particles are mindless and meaningless. And yet we think that we have lives that are full of consciousness, rationality, intelligence, language, ethics, aesthetics, politics, and all sorts of other things. Now, how do we reconcile the basic physical structure of the universe with our conception of ourselves as conscious, rational, free agents? Now, maybe we won't succeed in reconciling it. Maybe we'll have to give up on certain things like free will. But at any rate, we should start out assuming that our self-conception is more or less accurate, and that what we've learned from the natural sciences is accurate. How do we reconcile the two? And it's not enough that they should be consistent. You've got to show how the human reality is a natural outcome of the more basic reality. You've got to show how once you got protons, you're going to get presidents. And once you got electrons, you're going to get elections. The one has to be a natural consequence of the other. Okay. Now, last time I talked about one aspect of that problem, and that was consciousness. And I think that the big mistake in our history is one I pointed out last time, and that is the effort to deny that we live in one world. The effort to say, well, really, there are two worlds that we live in. A physical world, as described by science, and a spiritual world. And I think that is a deep mistake. I'm going to resist that. I'm going to say we live in one world, and I now have to show you how the things that we think are distinctive of human civilization are part of that one world, and they're a natural consequence of the more basic reality. So I'm going to be talking about what you could call, to use a fancy jargon, social ontology, the mode of existence of such social phenomena as money and property and government and marriage and universities and universities and income tax deductions and so on. There's a huge range of the social ontology. Now, philosophers like paradoxes, and I'm going to start with a paradox. All of this human reality is created by human consciousness, created by subjective consciousness, and yet it's an objective fact. It's an objective fact that I'm a citizen of the United States, that the piece of paper in my wallet is a $20 bill, and so on. How can there be an objective reality created by human subjectivity? Now, those of you who came Tuesday know the answer to that. The ontological subjectivity, the domain, does not prevent us from having an epistemically objective account of that domain. It's true, human consciousness has to create institutional reality. But once created, we can then state objective facts about it. It's an objective fact that I'm a professor in Berkeley, a citizen of the United States, that I owe a lot of credit card debts and all this kind of nonsense that we all live with. All right, now how does it actually work? What is the nature of the existence of this reality? And how do here we are, you see, I like to think of our history. We are, as far as we can tell, Darwinian natural selection has suited us just fine for a hunter-gatherer existence. And we apparently haven't had much change in our gene pool in the past 30,000 years, but we've had an enormous difference in the mode of existence of human life in those 30,000 years. And I want to talk about what the structure of that is. And I'm going to begin by contrasting us with other animals. It's a good idea and a good beginning point to think that we are continuous with other animals. We know enough about biology to see the commonality between us and other animals, especially us and the primates. All the same, with all the commonality, there is a whole range of terrific differences between us and any other animals known to me. My dog, my favorite example here, is very intelligent, but he's not worried about what he's going to do for Christmas vacation or how he's going to handle the income tax this year. He just does not have that kind of worry. Now, what's the matter with him? Is he being irresponsible? Well, no. I think we have an apparatus that gives us a kind of power that he doesn't have. And the first notion I want to introduce is the notion of an institutional fact. We have the capacity to create institutional facts, facts that presuppose human institutions, facts like the fact that you are students and faculty members of the University of Indiana, or that you're citizens of the United States. And we need to contrast institutional facts with brute facts. And the question is, how do you get from a world of brute facts, facts that don't presuppose any institutions, facts like the fact that hydrogen atoms have one electron and the Earth is 93 million miles from the sun, how do you get from those brute facts to facts about money and citizenship and property and marriage? And it seemed to me there was a rather simple answer to that question, and I'm going to give you that answer. It doesn't quite work, but it's pretty good, and then I'm going to improve on it. It seemed to me it's rather simple. You need just three things to get from brute reality to institutional reality. First of all, you need this remarkable capacity that humans and many other species have to cooperate. There's a piece of jargon that we use to describe this. You need a capacity for collective intentionality, for the ability to cooperate with other people. Okay, so you got now these beasts running around the woods, and they're able to cooperate with each other. What else do you need? Well, humans have a remarkable capacity that some animals have, but not all animals, and that is they can impose functions on objects. They can take an object and give it a function. So I'm sorry to give these sordid examples, but my pockets are full of objects that will perform various sordid functions like combing my hair or writing on paper or things that are too unmentionable to describe. But all of these are functional objects. Now notice an interesting thing. They perform their functions in virtue of their physical structure. So I can write with this damn thing, but I can't comb my hair with it. And I'll show you a thing that I can comb my hair with, but I can't write with it. All right. So far, so good. But then humans, in their ingenuity, have invented a great idea, and it is really the origin of civilization. Here it is. You can assign functions to objects and people where the function is not performed in virtue of the physical structure, or not solely in virtue of the physical structure, but in virtue of the fact that we have assigned a status to the person or the object, and with that status, a function that can only be performed in virtue of the collective acceptance of that status by the community, or at least a sizable number of the members of the community. And that's the first basic idea I want to introduce, is the notion of a status function. All functions are observer relative. It only has the function because we have assigned it the function. But status functions are remarkable because the status function doesn't perform the function in virtue of its physical structure, but in virtue of what? Well, in virtue of the beginning, we can say the fact that people accept it as having a certain status. And now I'll show off even more sordid objects I carry around with me. Here is another object that performs a function. It's a $5 bill. But unlike that other stuff I showed you, it doesn't perform the function in virtue of its physical structure. It performs the function in virtue of the fact that we accept or recognize or agree. It's in virtue of our attitudes that it performs the function of the $5 bill, not in virtue of its physical structure. So the question we have to ask is, how does that work? That's an amazing phenomenon. And for a long time, it seemed to me that the key to understanding this was that there are certain kind of rules, which I call constitutive rules, to distinguish them from regulative rules. Regulative rules regulate previously existing or independently existing forms of behavior. Drive on the right-hand side of the road. That's a regulative rule. But not all rules are like that. Some rules constitute the very behavior that they regulate, because performing the behavior consists in acting in accordance with the rules, or at least with a big enough subset of the rules. The philosopher's favorite example is always chess. It was not the case that a whole lot of people were pushing bits of wood around on boards, and some genius said, fellas, we got to get some rules, because you're always banging into my bishop with your knight. No, it's not like that. Rather, playing chess consists in acting in accordance with these rules. And typically these rules come in system. The rules of chess or the rules of football. Or a much more powerful example, the United States Constitution. It's a set of constitutive rules. Now, what do they look like, these constitutive rules? Well, they have a peculiar structure. They have the structure where something counts as something that it, so to speak, isn't intrinsically. X counts as Y in context C. So to take our chess example, such and such a position counts as a legal knight move. Such and such a position counts as you being in check. Such and such a form of check counts as you being in checkmate. Getting a majority of votes in the Electoral College counts as being president-elect, and being sworn in by the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court counts as becoming President of the United States. You build this structure up where you count something as something else. And it seemed to me that's how we do it. We build civilization by repeated application of constitutive rules. Now you might think, well, that's too pathetic an apparatus. You can't build civilization with that. It looks too fragile. But it has two formal properties that are remarkable. One formal property is it iterates upward indefinitely. So watch. I make noises through my mouth. They count as sentences of English. Some of those utterances of sentences count as the making of promises. Some promises count as undertaking a legal contract. Now watch what's happening in this case. We have X1 counts as Y1, but Y1 equals X2, and that counts as Y2, and we keep going up. So in the case of a marriage, in the case of the contract, making the noise counts as making a promise. Making that promise counts as creating a certain kind of contract, and certain kinds of contract count as getting married. Now, in the state of California, when you get married, all hell breaks loose from an institutional point of view. You're entitled to spousal benefits and pregnancy leaves. Even if you're a male, you can get a pregnancy leave, and I don't know what theory they have, but in any case, there are all these things that go on when you get this institutional status. So you have the status whereby you are married. That's an institutional fact, and that gives you a set of status functions. You have certain rights, duties, and obligations. Okay, another remarkable feature of this apparatus, this X counts as Y in C, is it interlocks with other status functions. So I don't just have money, but I have money in my bank account at the Bank of America on Telegraph Avenue in Berkeley, California. It's put there by my employers, the regents of the university, and I use it to pay my state and federal income tax, my credit card debts, and a whole lot of other things. Now notice, just about every noun I use there, with a possible exception of Telegraph Avenue, named a status function. It named some institutional thing. The Bank of America, my employers, the University of California. So one institution functions only by locking into a whole lot of other institutions. So it looks like a pretty good beginning to a theory. We're able to account for status functions by saying they arise as a result of application of constitutive rules, and the constitutive rules look are more powerful than they look on the surface, because they keep going up indefinitely. You can keep creating new institutional facts, and they interlock with each other. Nice theory, but philosophers will give you some counterexamples. And I want to tell you what's wrong with it, and then I'm going to improve on it. Okay, so how are we doing? I hope I'm not going too fast, because my natural temptation is I want to get to the part that most interests me. But in any case, I think everybody looks like they're following me so far. All right. Here are some interesting problems with this. Some I thought of myself, but some my friendly colleagues in philosophy thought of. They're called counterexamples. Here's a difficulty I thought of myself. Often you don't need a rule to create an institutional fact. A bunch of kids can just decide that somebody's going to be the captain of the softball team. They don't have to have a constitution to appeal to that. They just do it. They just haul off and count this guy as the captain of the softball team. But furthermore, and this is more troublesome, sometimes you don't even need an X term. You can create an institutional fact out of thin air. And my favorite example was always money. And I like to haul out a $20 bill and show it off. But the fact is, most money has no physical existence at all. There is no X that counts as a $20 bill in my bank account. You see, I'm very naive, and I think if I give these guys the money, and it's my bank account, there ought to be a drawer with my name on it where they keep my money, and I want to go and see my money in the bank. Well, that's not how it works. It's very disconcerting. Your money has no physical existence at all. There are magnetic traces on computer disks in the bowels of the bank, but those magnetic traces haven't got any money glued to them. They are representations of money. Now, here's a remarkable fact. In the case of money, which after all is very powerful, you don't need any actual object to bear the status function. Just the representation will do. And we could buy and sell just by exchanging representations. And that's what we're moving toward with a debit card. With a debit card, you don't actually have any cash, any currency that backs up the exchange. You just exchange the numerical value. You change the numerical value in your account for a numerical value in somebody else's account. This is mind-boggling for philosophers. As I told you last time, to be a philosopher, you got to allow yourself to be astounded by what any sane person takes for granted. Okay. Now, I am astounded by this fact about money, that there is no actual currency. Here's an even more astounding fact, and that is, in their ingenuity, humans have invented whole institutions that do not require any physical reality at all. And the most famous example is the limited liability corporation. Now, there's a wonderful research assistant I have called Google. And if I look up on Google the law for creating corporations in the state of California, it just says you create a corporation by saying you're creating a corporation. That's all I have to do. As it says, you file articles of incorporation. What's going on in these cases? How can there be a powerful institution, corporations, that have no physical existence at all? See, that corporation may have a building, which is its office, but that's not the corporation. That's just the building. The actual corporation is purely abstract. So what's going on? Okay, now I want to start the second part of the lecture, where I'm going to try to show how to assimilate this account that I gave you into a much more general account. And to do that, I need to tell you a little bit about how language works, because my essential message is going to be that human civilization is created by a certain very specific type of speech act, by a very specific type of language act, and we're not all that smart that we can do new and original things every time. We apply the same thing over and over again. That's what that's the bottom line of my discussion, but I have to work up to that. Okay, so how are we doing? I'm going to take a drink of water and catch my breath and go into the next part. Now, human beings have another remarkable trait, language. Now, we're familiar with the idea that there are signaling systems among animals, and some of them are rich enough I think, to be called a language. I think the B language probably qualifies as a language. There's not going to be any Proust among the Bs, but it's clearly a signaling system that represents information in a complex fashion. And one of the things I like about it, it's clear that it's not just a matter of stimulus and response. My favorite experiment was this one. They took a boatload of flowers and carted it out in the middle of a lake. And then the bee went out in the middle of the lake, found this boatload of flowers, and she went back to the hive and told all her sisters, they're all females in the society, told her sisters, there are all these great flowers out there in the middle of the lake. They didn't show any interest at all. They just didn't believe it, that there were all these flowers to be found in the middle of the lake. Now, I think that's very human of them. I like that. Okay, so now I don't know what you can do with a bee language, but I know there are things you can do with human language that you cannot do with any others, and I want to tell you about how that works. Human speech acts typically have this kind of structure. You have a certain force, what Austin called illocutionary force, and a propositional content. So I can predict that you will leave the room, I can order that you will leave the room, I can ask whether you will leave the room. In each case, the same proposition as a different kind of speech act, a different kind of what Austin called illocutionary acts. Now, if you look at that, you wonder how many of those kinds of things are there. And one of the ways of distinguishing among them is distinguish ways they relate to reality. So the philosopher's favorite, the statement, is supposed to be true or false. And it's true whether or not, if the statement up here matches the reality down here. And I think in simple metaphors, think of that as having a fit where the word is supposed to fit the world. That's the word-to-world direction of fit. And the simplest mark for whether a speech act has that direction of fit is, can you literally say that it's true or false? These are true or false. But of course, not all speech acts are like that. Sometimes you give somebody an order or you make a promise, and there you're supposed to change reality if it's a promise, or the person given the order is supposed to change reality to match the content of the speech act. Is supposed to change the world to match the words. So this kind over here has the world-to-word direction of fit. The world is supposed to change to match the world, and you match the world and the word. And you don't call those true or false. The order is said to be obeyed or disobeyed. The promise is said to be kept or broken. So you got these two basic ways that language has of relating to reality. You represent how things are. That's the word-to-world, true-false direction of fit. Or you try to change reality so it matches how things are in the representation. And that's orders and promises. Now, sometimes you get cases where the fit is taken for granted. For when I apologize for stepping on your foot, I'm not trying to get your foot stepped on, and I'm not claiming that I stepped on it. I'm just expressing my regret. So there we just take the fit for granted. So we've got different classes of speech acts, though, corresponding to these. We have an assertive class, the aim of which is to tell us how things are in reality, and that includes statements and descriptions. All the philosopher's favorites are in these assertives. Then you have the directive class, and that includes orders and commands. These have this direction of fit. The directives have this direction of fit. Directives are orders and commands as well as suggestions and requirements. Okay, but now there's another class where you commit yourself to doing something, and those I call commissives, the commissive class, and the philosopher's favorite is the promise, where you promise, vow, threat, pledge, and thus create reasons for doing something. I'm going through this fast, but I want you to get the basic idea. Language has different ways of relating to reality. And the two favorite ways are this way, where you try to say how things are in the world, and this way, which breaks into two kinds, hearer-based, the directive, and speaker-based, the commissive. The directive, you're trying to get somebody to do something. In the commissive, you're committing yourself to doing something. Now, there is this weird class, the expressives, where you apologize, thank, congratulate, and those I just call expressives, where the aim is not to fit reality, but to express an attitude. But now, here is the amazing thing. There's an amazing group of speech acts that I call declarations. And those are the cases where you make something the case by just saying that it's the case. The chairman can adjourn the meeting by saying the meeting is adjourned. And you can fire an employee just by saying you're fired. Or you can hire somebody just by saying you're hired. Or you can pronounce a couple husband and wife if you're duly authorized by saying, I pronounce you husband and wife. Now, what's going on in these cases? What is going on, I'm going to put very simply by saying, in these cases, you get a double direction of fit. You get a world-to-word direction of fit when you say the meeting is adjourned, because the world changes. It's now adjourned. The meeting is now adjourned. But the way it became adjourned is you represented it as being adjourned. That is to say, you achieved the world-to-word direction of fit by way of the word-to-world direction of fit. You performed not two speech acts. You didn't make a statement that the meeting is adjourned and then give an order that it be adjourned. You made one speech act that included both. That's a stunning fact. Now, how do those work? Well, the favorite examples are Austin's examples of performatives, where you make an order by saying, I order you to leave the room. You make a promise by saying, I promise to come and see you. You adjourn the meeting by saying the meeting is adjourned. You give and bequeath your watch to your nephew by saying, I give and bequeath my watch to my nephew. All of those cases, you have a verb or verb phrase, such as promise or order or adjourn. But you don't always need a special sentence to do that. You can do it, a special kind of sentence. You can do it with any sentence, provided it's understood in the right way. And again, my favorite example is in my wallet. And again, it's another case of being astounded by the obvious. There are stunning philosophical claims made on this sheet of paper. It says, this note is legal tender for all debts, public and private. Now, we're all epistemologists, and our natural inclination is to say, how the hell do they know? Has there been a study? Has there been a survey? They say arrogantly, it's legal tender for all debts, public and private. What's the evidence that it's legal tender? And the answer, of course, is they don't discover that it's legal tender. They make it legal tender by declaring it to be legal tender. That's a declaration. So the declaration there, this note is legal tender, looks like an ordinary statement of fact, but it's not. It isn't that they did a serious survey and discovered, yep, really is legal tender. No, they made it legal tender by declaration. Now, this is a remarkable fact, that human beings have the capacity to create a reality simply by declaring it to exist. Performatives, to repeat, are the favorite example, but it needn't be a performative verb. There needn't be a special verb that you use, as in, I hereby adjourn the meeting, or I hereby order you to leave the room. You can just make a statement, and if it's accepted as generally creating the reality that it describes, then you have successfully performed a declaration. Now I want to make the strongest claim of the whole lecture, and that's this. All of human institutional reality, money, property, government, marriage, universities, cocktail parties, summer vacations, and all the rest of it, that is created by, I have to put this carefully, representations that have the logical form of the speech act of declaration. It needn't be explicit. You don't have to come out and say explicitly, you're the boss, or we hereby make you the boss. That would be an explicit declaration. But you can make somebody the boss just by treating her as the boss, just by always referring to her as the boss. By representing her as being the boss, you can make it the case that she is the boss. So what happens in all of these phenomena is that you create an institutional fact by representing that institutional fact as existing, and that has the logical form of the declaration. So the shorthand is simply to say all of human institutional reality, and thus all of what is distinctive about human societies, how we differ from other animal societies, is created by repeated applications of the same type of speech act, the declaration. Now, just to have a name for those, I want to tie that into what I said earlier about how we have the capacity to assign functions through collective intentionality. And some of these functions are status functions. And the thesis that I'm now advancing is this. All status functions are created by declaration. They're all created by the same type of speech act. I have to qualify that and say by representations that have the logical form of the declaration, because you needn't do it explicitly. You can do it just by accepting something or recognizing it, but there has to be a representation that enables you to do that, to create the institutional fact. Okay, but now you got a whole lot of interesting questions, if I'm right so far, that this is the distinctive feature of human civilization. It looks like we get an interesting set of equations. And the equations come out as this. Status functions, where you have a function that is performed in virtue of the collective acceptance of a status, status functions are coextensive with institutional facts. Institutional facts are created for the purpose of creating these status functions. What's the point? Why do we create all these status functions? Why do we make somebody chairman of the department, pronounce somebody husband and wife, make somebody president of the United States, create money and private property and government and marriage? And the answer is all of those are status functions. Yes, but what's the function? What's the point of the function? And the answer to that is we do it for power. All of those create power structures. All institutional reality is a matter of creating power structures. So if you have a $5 bill, you have a power that you don't have if you don't have that money. If you're a chairman of the philosophy department, you have power that you don't have if you're not chairman. A lot of the powers are negative powers. So as a professor in Berkeley, I have a positive power to get a parking permit. That won't give me a parking space, but at least I have a permit. It gives me a right to look for a parking space. But I also have negative powers. I'm under an obligation to show up and teach my students on such and such a day. So status functions are institutional facts. Institutional facts, without exception, create powers, but the powers are of a very peculiar kind. They're what I call deontic powers, and I call them that because the names of these types of powers would include rights, duties, obligations, authorizations, permissions, requirements, and others in that family. Now, this again is a remarkable fact about human beings. As far as I know, a pack of dogs does not create a system of obligations and rights and duties within the system, within the pack. They may create a hierarchy where there's an alpha male and an alpha female, but they do not create deontic powers with institutional facts and status functions. The reason that it's such a big deal that status functions are institutional facts, they're created by this constitutive operation. They're all created by status function declarations. And the reason that's such a big deal is that these, well, I put in here status function declarations, because the speech acts in question that create the status functions have the logical form of the declarations, and so I call them status function declarations. And they create, in creating institutional reality, they create a system of deontic powers, and deontic powers are remarkable in this respect. They lock into human rationality. They lock into human rationality in such a way that they give you reasons for acting that are independent of your inclinations. So if you recognize an obligation as a binding obligation, you recognize that you have a desire-independent reason for acting on that obligation. I'll give you a real-life example. A nice guy invited me to go to Bloomington, Indiana, and give some lectures. It seemed like a great idea, many months away. But then a day comes when you got to get up early in the morning and make your way to San Francisco Airport, and then it's just, well, you know what it's like. You got to stand in line, you got to take your shoes off, and you got to eat airplane food, and you don't even get much of that anymore. And then, worst of all, you got to try to put your elbow where some other guy's trying to put his elbow, and so on. So nobody does it for fun. On the other hand, there was no question. I had made a promise. I had created an institutional fact, and my promising that institutional fact had created a reason for acting that was independent of my inclination. I had a reason for coming, and here I am. I gave this example once in Chicago to a famous seminar occupied by a conservative economist, to put it charitably. And they don't think anybody ever did anything for a desire-independent reason. And they said, you just came to Chicago because you were worried about what we would think of you if you didn't come to Chicago. And I didn't have the heart to tell them, I don't give a damn what you guys think of me. I didn't have the heart to tell them that. Anyway, I made it there. I got out of there alive. Anyway, so here is the thesis that I am advancing. We live in a sea of status functions. The marvelous thing is they're almost totally invisible because you take them for granted. The clothes on my back are my private property. I am a citizen of the United States, a possessor of a valid California driver's license, the ower of money on my various credit cards, and so on. The list is huge. Many status functions of the kind that I described to you are codified. It's easy to make a law about these, and laws naturally tend to proliferate. Why? Because the status function only exists if it's represented as existing, and if you've got the representation, then it's relatively easy to codify the representation. There are some status functions that are not codified and would suffer if they were codified. Think of cocktail parties, love affairs, and friendship. Now, all of those are status functions. The test is there a set of obligations and other deontic powers that go with inviting people to a cocktail party or having a friend? Are there obligations of friendship or obligations of a love affair? And the answer seems to me in every case, yes. But you don't want to try to codify it because partly you're inventing it as you go along. You're inventing the structure of the institutional fact. If it's a friendship or a love affair, and if it gets codified, you get serious, then it becomes much more flexible. Now, you will suffer from problems when you go to other countries where they have maybe a different conception of a love affair, a different conception of friendship, and you can get in a lot of trouble. I won't even go through into the details about that, about the different conceptions. Okay, but now another result that comes out of this discussion is that language, unlike my earlier view, is not just one system of status functions among others. It's the basic human institution in this sense. All other human institutions that I mentioned, like government and private property and universities, all of them presuppose language. You can have a society that has a language but doesn't have money or private property or government, but you can't have the converse. You could not have, if an anthropologist comes back from the Amazon basin and says her tribe has language, but they don't have private property and they don't have a government, that makes sense. But if she comes back and says they have private property, government, marriage, and money, but they do not have a language, we know that couldn't be right, because language is the fundamental human institution in that all others presuppose language. But then now there's an interesting asymmetry. I originally got this idea of the constitutive rule X counts as Y as a way of describing the operation of language, as the performance of the Speech Act. Uttering the sentence, "Snow is white," in English, counts as making the statement that snow is white. But now it turns out there's a big asymmetry between the operation of the constitutive rules with language and their operation with, so to speak, non-linguistic institutional facts like money and private property. The asymmetry is this. In the case of the status functions and the deonic powers that are non-linguistic, for example, when we make somebody president of the United States, we use language to create power that goes beyond the power of language. So we use language to say, by the authority vested in I hereby pronounce you president of the United States. The guy then has powers that go beyond the powers of language, but when we just use a sentence to make a statement, there are no powers that go beyond the powers of language. So the way, as a speaker of English, my knowledge of English enables me to have the power to make the statement that snow is white by uttering the sentence, "Snow is white." That's a case where the semantics is all the power there is. The powers are just the semantic powers. But when you make somebody chairman of the philosophy department, or you admit them to graduate school, or you award somebody a prize, or you pronounce somebody husband and wife, or you borrow money from the bank, or you buy a house in Bloomington, all of those are cases where you create institutional facts and thus create deontic powers, and you use language to do that. But the powers that you create go beyond semantic powers. So all of Barack Obama's powers derive from semantics. He has to be created as president and treated as president, represented as president, but the powers go beyond semantics. The power to command American troops in battle goes far beyond the semantics, even though the initial origin of the power is on the basis of the semantics. The semantics creates powers that are not semantic. So it turns out that language is not only the fundamental human social institution, the one that all others derive from, all others depend on, but it's fundamentally different in its operation, because it, just as far as the meanings of the sentences are concerned, all you have when you know the language is the power to perform speech acts with those sentences. But when you're locked into a system of institutional facts and status functions and deonic powers, when you're buying and selling stocks on the stock market, or you're passing legislation in Congress, or you're a judge adjudicating cases, all of those cases involve the use of language, but they use language to create powers that go beyond language. Okay, how am I doing for time? Well, maybe I'll try and summarize so we'll have plenty of time for discussion. Now, there are a few things I want to say of a theoretical kind before I throw it open for discussion. One is, it seems to me if you think along these lines, as I'm suggesting, you get a different conception of many traditional questions in the social sciences and in political philosophy. If you look at our tradition in political and social theory, there is an endemic flaw that goes back to the Greeks, and that is, roughly speaking, they had an impoverished theory of language. They took language for granted. The social contract theorists are the worst because they assume that we're running around the woods speaking a language, and then some genius says, let's make a social contract. And then you get together and you have a society. But what the implication of what I'm saying is, if you've got a language, you've already got an implicit social contract because you have the possibility of creating status functions. Now, how do we get away with it? You see, what's amazing is we get away with it. And the short answer to that is, you get away with it if people accept it. And the most amazing creation of a status function by declaration were by guys who wrote as if they had read my book. They used the very terminology. They call it the Declaration of Independence. Now there's nothing, you see, there's nothing in their status functions prior to that moment that gives them the power to do this. These are, let us not forget, British subjects. They're not citizens of anything. They're subjects of King George III Where? In a British crown colony, Philadelphia. It's a crown colony. It's got a status function. It's entirely under the government of the royal family in London, and they just got together and performed a collective speech act. They said, we declare ourselves to be an independent nation. Now, they got away with it. How did they get away with it? Well, the short answer is they got people to accept it. And we're here because people accept it, and we accept it. The long answer is they had to fight a war to get the acceptance. And it wasn't really until Cornwallis was defeated at Yorktown that they were free and clear. And by the way, something Americans tend to forget, we couldn't have won the war without the help of the French. The French were essential in the creation of our country. So remember that when the French complain about us and we complain about them, which is a common domestic conversation. So here are these guys who created an institutional reality of enormous power. However, it doesn't always work. A bunch of people, I guess, in Richmond tried to do the same stunt. You know, they had a good model. They created the Confederate States of America, and it didn't work. They did not, again, it took a war to settle the issue, but the issue was settled. But the remarkable thing is that your life is entirely structured within a series of complex families of status functions. They're all created by the same simple logical linguistic operation applied over and over, the status function declaration. See, we're not smart enough to do something new and original every time. We have this device for creating status functions. It's the status function declaration, and we apply it over and over. Now, I think, as I said, a lot of traditional issues are clarified if you adopt the approach that's implicit in what I've been saying. Let me conclude with one thought. There are huge debates that go on in this country and internationally about human rights, about universal human rights. And the question is, what is the ontology of the human rights? And there are a class of philosophers who are very skeptical, like Jeremy Bentham and Alistair McIntyre. They think talk of human rights is nonsense. What are you talking about? But I think, in fact, the talk can be made legitimate once you recognize what's actually going on. You don't have human rights the way you have thumbs. The human right is a status function. What's different about human rights and other rights is that other rights typically arise within a pre-existing institution. As a citizen, I have certain rights. As a husband, I have certain rights. As a professor, I have certain rights. But somebody in the 18th century, I don't know who it was, or maybe it was 17th century, but it's in the Enlightenment, somebody or some group of people got an idea of genius. Just being a human being is a Y status function. They didn't have the right terminology for saying that. But that's what they were trying to say. Just being a human being is a Y status function, and as such, it carries deontic powers. It carries universal human rights. And I think that can be made intellectually legitimate. Once you recognize that human rights are universal status functions created and maintained by a certain type of speech act, and that speech act is the status function declaration. Now, another claim I haven't really had time to develop is that the institutional facts are not only created in their initial form by the status function declaration, but that's how they're maintained over a period of time. You maintain the system in power by constantly representing it as the power structure that it is. So one of the ways to see this is to see the way that revolutionary movements want to change the vocabulary. At the time of the Russian Revolution, the revolutionaries were very anxious that people not use the traditional forms of address of traditional Russia. They wanted everybody to be called comrade. Why? Because that marked an equality of status function, which calling somebody a lord or a duke or whatever would not accept. So they were insistent on changing the vocabulary. And more recently, the feminists in the early days of feminism were anxious that we not use the traditional vocabulary of ladies and gentlemen, because that marked status functions that they were anxious to overcome. Now, I don't know how these things develop. It's quite interesting. If you, and somebody in Moscow today, I think if you address him as comrade, it'll be a joke. I mean, because the system that was created that has become undermined. But even this is going on as we speak. If you look at older American laws, the word spinster occurs commonly. Now, I once asked my class, how many of you are spinsters? Please raise your hand. One middle-aged woman had a courage to raise her hand. I wanted to give her an A on the spot. Because this is a term that is becoming obsolete. It did mark a status function, and I think bachelor may be becoming obsolete, what with a change in what with hesitation I call marital practices. But with the relation to the sexes, we may be going for all sorts of new vocabularies. But the vocabulary is crucial because the vocabulary is the articulation of the assignment of a status function. So I think that I have only really begun a subject, but what I want to suggest, and I'll conclude with this, is that when I use this somewhat provocative title, The Logical Structure of Human Civilization, unfortunately, most people think I mean logical as opposed to illogical. That's not the point. The point is that it has a propositional structure. The propositional structure is the assignment of a status function according to the Speech Act of Declaration that makes something the case by representing it as being the case. And wherever you have propositional structures, you have logical relations. That's why I call it the logical structure of human civilization. But this, I think, is how we differ from other social animals. There are lots of social animals. Lots of them have power structures and hierarchies where there are alpha males and alpha females, but they do not have this remarkably rich, stable system of status functions that we have. I visited Mike Tomasello at his primate lab in Leipzig, and he's got all these primates that are busy fighting it out every day. Who's going to be the alpha male today? And the alpha male has to find allies among other males to fight off other alpha males. Now, that's not how it works in the White House. Barack Obama does not get up and think, today I got to beat everybody in arm wrestling or whatever it might be. No, he's got an accepted system of status functions, and that persists through time. And this is a feature both of good institutions and bad institutions, but I'm convinced that it is the key to understanding the ontology of human civilization. Thank you. Okay, guy on the left.
I have a question. Would that question be in one of those categories? Or
Questions are, I didn't give you a lecture on speech acts. Questions are a species of directive. Every question is a request. It's a request for an answer. And indeed, there's a remarkable thing about questions in English, that the form of the question determines the form of the answer. So if I answer, do you have any bananas, and you say yes, that doesn't mean yes, it's going to rain tomorrow. It means yes, we have bananas. And the one exception to this is the peculiar English modal auxiliary verb. So if I ask you, shall I marry a Republican, the correct answer is not yes, you shall, or no, you shall not, but rather yes, do, or no, don't. It asks for advice. But that modal auxiliaries are hard to think about anyway. But go ahead. Questions are directives. Yes?
that sort of was my question.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Okay. All right. Well,
I was kind of thinking in the sense of anything from satisfying curiosity to questioning authority, like,
yeah.
Who do you think you are? What do you think you're doing?
Okay, now, I resist the temptation to give a lecture on questions. They're a fascinating subject. And one interesting class are rhetorical questions. When the guy in the Republican National Convention says, do we want 4 more years of incompetent government? He doesn't want people to think about it. Think, oh, I don't know, do we or don't we? I guess we do. No, it's not the form of the question. So rhetorical questions are interesting in that the rhetorical question makes a statement by assuming that the answer to the question is known. It assumes the answer is known. Consequently, you use the rhetorical question to make a statement. So questions are fascinating, a lot to be said. But in any case, the short answer is real honest to John questions like, how do I find my way to Bloomington? That is a directive where you're asking for information. Yes. Oh, no. Yeah, let's guy over here first, and then we'll come back to you. Yeah.
I agree with most of what you say, but I want to draw...
Watch out when somebody says that, because he's now going to tell us what he disagrees with.
I want to draw attention to an important fact. Namely, you, for example, have a California driving license.
Yeah.
Now, suppose I were visiting California, I didn't bring my driver's license. You couldn't say, Rohit, that's all right, just take mine.
Yeah.
On the other hand, I have also a lunch coupon for lunch tomorrow.
Yeah.
I could give that coupon to somebody else.
Yeah.
And that person could eat lunch instead of me. So it's important that the driver's license is unique to you.
Yeah.
And when a policeman stops you, he wants to know that it's John Searle
Yes.
who was speeding and
Yeah.
not Kirk Ludwig. Whereas on the other hand, when it comes to lunch, it doesn't matter who is
Yeah.
eating the lunch, because they want to make sure that the number of coupons equals the number of people who paid.
Yes. No,
So there are some important properties about these certificates of power.
no, that's absolutely right, and I'm grateful for the contribution. I want to say a little bit more about it. Many status function attached to specific individuals, named individuals. So you're named in the driver's license or on the marriage license. You can't prove you're married by borrowing my marriage license. Okay, I mean, it is specific. The beauty of money is it's fungible. Anybody with the money can use it to buy something with. But all sorts of other things are not in that way exchangeable. Now, there's another topic I didn't have a chance to go into, but I want to use this occasion to mention it, and that is that often we need indicators. You need status function indicators. So the policeman wears a uniform, and the actual license that I have is not the status function. It's an indicator that I am able to drive. It's what I call a status function indicator. And these wedding rings, uniforms, driver's licenses, all of these are status function indicators, and their primary function is epistemic. They prove that I have the status that I claim to have. Now, they can acquire a kind of life of their own. So the driver's license in California is used for all kinds of things that have nothing to do with driving. You can't buy a beer if you haven't got a driver's license, because you can't prove that you're over 21. And so sometimes the status indicators will acquire a kind of separate life of their own. But the basic idea is that for many status functions, you need to indicate that you have the status function by some epistemic device. When I first got to Berkeley, you could tell who the professors were. They were the guys with ties on. Ties and jackets. Then in the 60s, you could tell the professors, they were the ones with shoes on, because the dressing habits had changed by then. So you get these. And part of the problem in my old university, Oxford, is that when I was a student there, you could identify who was a member of the university by their clothing. They wore, the kind of stuff I got on, roughly speaking. They had on worsted flannel slacks and usually tweed jackets. This wouldn't qualify. But in any case, there was no question about improper people wandering in the university. They would be immediately identified by their style of dress. Now, everybody wears blue jeans. They imitate the Americans. So you can't do that anymore, and people have now started locking their doors. You have to lock your door in Oxford the way you didn't used to, because it was all members of the upper class, and they were readily identifiable by their dress. Okay, wait, did you finish? Yeah, I'm sorry. Thanks for the question. Okay, you're on.
In the beginning of your talk, you talked about physical particles like protons and electrons.
Yeah.
But you haven't said a word about how you get from protons and electrons to human beings or to civilization.
Okay, let me answer that question. Unfortunately, I only had 2 lectures to give here. One was about consciousness. So let me give you the short answer. To begin with, I'm not sure they're particles. Maybe points of mass energy or strings, but that's not what I'm paying the physicists to do, to settle on the basic, the ontology of the basic entities. Okay, those are organized into systems. Now, on our little Earth, some of those particles are organized into large molecules containing lots of carbon with hydrogen, nitrogen, and oxygen. And some of those systems of carbon-based molecules became alive. Now, to this day, we don't know when and how and where that happened, but it did happen. It's an amazing fact. And some of those living organic systems, continue to evolve, and we're now talking about millions of years, continue to evolve until they became animals. And some animals evolved consciousness. And now that's what I talked about last time, is how the brain creates consciousness. And we still don't understand that. We don't know how exactly the brain creates consciousness or how exactly it functions in the brain, but we know that it does. Now, this lecture was the next step where once you've got consciousness, then you can get language. And I didn't discuss the structures of language, I just talked about some of the uses. And now once you have language, you have the possibility of creating society, human society and human civilization. So the pattern goes from the basic physical reality of physical particles to the beginnings of life in carbon-based molecules, and then the development of life through evolution, and then the development of evolutionary mechanisms through the development of animals, and conscious animals, and then the development of language, and then us, and then all of the stuff we got. That's the picture. I should have spelled that out, but that's how you get from protons to presidents. You get from having the basic system of the physical particles, some of those become alive, a stunning fact, and some of those living systems evolve over long periods of evolutionary time, and then over that long period of time, you eventually reach folks like us. Now, we ought not to be arrogant about our special situation. As I mentioned before, we are a very small solar system in a big galaxy, and there are 100 billion stars in our galaxy. I don't know how many of them can support life or planets like as ours do. But our galaxy, with its 100 billion stars, it's one of 100 billion galaxies. So it seems to me unlikely that we're the only conscious beasts in the universe. I don't suppose that other beasts in the universe look like us. Why should they? I mean, we're freaks of a certain kind of evolution. And if they could see us, no reason why they have the ability to see, but if they could see us, we probably look as freakish to them as they do to us. So we can't assume that we're the only possible reasonable way for life to come about. But it's what we got. It's what we have to live with. Now, that's the good news. There are only 100 billion stars in our galaxy and only 100 billion galaxies. I've been telling my students this for years. Here's the bad news. And I only discovered this in my physics fans frequently. The story I told you only covers 4% of the universe. Oh, yeah? What about the other 96%? I paid to hear about that. Well, the other 96% is dark matter and dark energy. And what's dark about it? It's epistemic darkness. The damn physicists haven't figured it out. They have pretty good reasons for believing in it. I mean, here's the thing they say that always drives me crazy. The universe is expanding. What's it expanding in? You know, if I say, we've decided to expand the kitchen, okay, well, then it's got to expand into the backyard. But if we say, oh, yeah, and by the way, we're going to expand the kitchen and expand the universe. What do I expand the universe in? Well, there is an answer to that, but they've been misleading us. And the answer is, to say the universe is expanding is to say the galaxies are getting farther apart. And they are. What's the force that's driving them farther apart? Well, there's dark energy, as well as dark matter. So we really are very ignorant of some of the most fundamental facts about the nature of ourselves and the nature of the universe. We really don't know much about how the universe works. And in a way, worse yet, we don't know much about how we work. We don't know how our brain creates consciousness. We don't know how life began. We do know that it did begin and it did evolve, and we have some conception of those mechanisms, but we're still ignorant of a whole lot of areas. Well, that's what makes philosophy fun, is we got a lot to work on. Okay, who's next? I think this guy's next. Okay, you're on.
You've been talking about some of the implications of the performative for social power and even social change. The subtitle of Jared Diamond's book, Collapse, is How Societies Choose to Succeed or Fail. Yeah. Would you give us some hints about how we might avoid catastrophic collapse, and whether exactly whether there might be any performative incantation that would help in that task?
Well, that's why I love easy questions. I don't have a general theory of society or social collapse. So I'm the wrong guy to ask this question of. If I got a good characterization of social ontology, the mode of existence, then I can go on from there. But I haven't gone on from there. The question would be, well, what makes a good institution is a bad institution? And there, it seems to me, you have to ask questions about, well, what constitutes human flourishing, and what sorts of healthy societies will facilitate human flourishing. And it seems to me there are lots of them in the world today that are not very healthy. But Americans love to criticize themselves. I think we're pretty well off compared with, let's say, what's happening in Syria. I'm sure there are lots of joys to be had in Syria, but right now I'd rather be in Indiana and a whole lot of other areas of the world that's true. So I don't have an answer to your question, but what I provide, I hope, is a framework for an ontology for posing the questions. Okay, you're on.
Oh, okay. This one's a doozy, all right? And it's been bothering me for a while. What the hell is an institution, and what the hell is a society? I mean, the institution is more important because you've been using the word a lot. An institution, what is that?
Yeah, as I've told you, an institution is a system of constitutive rules. Within those systems of constitutive rules, you create institutional facts. All institutional facts are created by the application of a same type of speech act or the same type of linguistic representation, a status function declaration. Now, there are immediate objections to that because some of the things we think of as institutions are not institutional facts on my account. So the Christian calendar is not an institution because being such and such a date doesn't carry a deontology. The test is, does it carry a deontology? Christmas Day is an institutional fact because I have obligations and rights on Christmas Day. I am obligated to give my children presents, and I have a right to a day off. That marks it as an institutional fact. That's a status function. So there are tests for status functions. Does it carry deontology? But the short answer is institutions are systems of constitutive rules. They enable the creation of institutional facts by status function declarations. Status function declarations, without exception, create deontic powers. And deontic powers are the glue that holds human civilization together because they give us reason for acting that are independent of our immediate inclinations. Okay, that's a summary of the lecture. Yeah. Okay.
You brought this up towards the end concerning conflict and the degree to which declarations must be accepted en masse for them to have causative effect. But then it seems that this propositional logical structure doesn't have very much prescriptive power. Most of the things you can prove from this logical structure are actually descriptive. I look at my set of axioms, which are the result of having already fought wars, and then I draw the facts from there. So my predecessor on this side asked for, could you avert society, simply by describing society as an iterative process of declarations. But I have a more basic question. Does this actually give you any prescriptive,
Yeah.
proof-based power at all? Or do you throw it out there and then see who wins might makes right style?
Yeah. Well, okay, that's a larger question than I'll really be able to answer. But I would say there are lots of institutions that are so obviously useful to all of us that they really are not subject to challenge as institutions. The most obvious is language. If you think that private property is a bad idea, okay, you can argue against private property, but how would you argue against language? You'd have to use language to argue against language, and I mean, it's just pretty hard to see language being challenged as an institution. Now, some institutions are inherently evil. Slavery seems to me, slavery of human beings seems to me inherently evil. But then that's something you can argue for. That's something you can, within institutional structures, you can make that out. There are some, as I said, institutions that are so obviously beneficial to everybody that it's very hard to see how anybody could argue against them. And language is the most obvious case. But there are others. How about money? Money is an institution. Is it beneficial? I think on balance it is. It's famously the root of all evil, but it's the root of an awful lot of good, too. I try to imagine what your life would be like if you had no possibility of buying and selling or being paid for your work or anything like that. It's very hard to imagine how you would organize a decent life. So there are lots of institutions that are very pervasive that are effectively harmless. Now, how about private property? Well, I think private property, again, benefits just about everybody. But we now have, in the United States, such a disproportionate concentration of private property, the famous 1%. The wealth is so disproportionately concentrated that it seems to me very unhealthy. It's just not a healthy way to run a society, to have so much power, so much deonic power in the hands of so few people. For one thing, it gives them a disproportionate amount of political power. And these are real problems that we're going to have to face. So I think if you want to ask about a given institution, is this institution a good one or a bad one, you have to tell me more about the institution and what it does, how it functions in human life. Yeah.
I'd like to follow up on a question that was asked on this side a little earlier when you were asked to spell out a little bit more about the way that you get from molecules to presidents and so forth. And what I'm going to ask you, some people would object to the treatment of things like presidents and elections on the same ontological plane as molecules and particles. And I wonder if you could say a little bit more about the logic that allows from a materialist conception of the world as reducible to material, how things emerge from that and can exist in any way on a different level.
Okay, no, that's a very good question. One of the things I hope is implicit in what I've said is that the traditional distinctions between the material and the mental, or the material and the ideal, I think those are all obsolete. I mean, we live in one world. Its basic structure is that of physical particles. Among the physical features of the world is consciousness, but I mean real honest-to-John consciousness, with all its subjectivity, touchy-feely features. And then organized systems of consciousness through collective intentionality create human civilization. That's the story about how you get from the protons to the presidents. Of course, there are several steps in that story we just don't understand. We don't understand how life got started. It did. We don't understand how consciousness got started. And we really don't understand how human languages took off. And we may never really understand that because there's no fossil evidence. You can't look at the fossils and see whether or not these guys had a subject verb language or a language where the verb came first. You can't look at that. Look at the skull and discover that. So we may never have a full understanding of how these things developed, but they did develop. We did evolve from a universe in which, or a solar system at least, in which there were no living beings. We evolved into us, and we did evolve culturally into something that's far more complicated and far more interesting, I think, than a hunter-gatherer existence. We're no longer just running around the woods trying to find enough food to get through the rest of the day. Any other questions? I've answered every question. Yeah. Thank you.